Alrighty. Hello, Al. This is the very first episode of the Cybernetics House. And today I'm speaking to Paul Pangaro. Paul is such a character, let me put it that way. He's a very fascinating creature, very much involved with the key figures in cybernetics and just an extraordinary human being in general.
Thank you.
Um, just before I introduce him or let him introduce himself, better yet, I'm Guy. I'm a undergrad at Stanford University. I'm Brazilian originally, and this is the Metasystemic Project, which is a space dedicated to exploring cybernetics. And I'm going to pass it to Keaton to introduce himself a little bit.
Yeah, hey, I'm Keaton. I was also recently at Stanford studying a mixture of different things, including complex systems and artificial intelligence. But yeah, now I'm working in kind of the AI risk space, but also with a special interest in kind of getting the conversations around cybernetics revived as well. And we'd love to do that through the Cybernetics House.
All right. So, Paul, who are you in general?
I don't know. I wish I knew. It's a fair question. I'm not sure the scope of it. I've been involved in the cybernetics world for a long time, since just after graduating with a bachelor's, although I had met originally Jerry Letfin, who was a biologist and very close to Maturana, collaborator of his, and both collaborators with McCullough, Warren McCullough. And Letvin was talking stuff that when I finally met Gordon Pask in person in Nicholas Negroponte's lab, I was just thunderstruck. And I started following Gordon around, and I dropped out of the PhD program with Nicholas at MIT and went to England and spent time on and off there and started a company there in order to collaborate with Pask. I was involved a bit in the American Society for Cybernetics in the 80s when Pask and Maturana and Varela came once. Stafford Beer came to some other meetings in cybernetics in the 80s. Heinz von Forster was a major character and one of the greats. And always my interest in Pask was, I'm not a theorist, I'm not a philosopher, but I'm a pragmatist. And as a colleague of mine says, there's nothing more practical than a good theory. So I could, on reading Pask and talking to him, I could write code based on what he said. Psychology, you can't write code. AI, you can write code, but I think it's misguided. And so my whole career, from my dissertation with Pask through a bunch of startups, not continuously from the time I graduated MIT as an undergrad to the time I entered academia full-time, which was 2015. And all those years, I had a number of startups, nearly all of which involved some Paskian ideas one way or another. Didn't succeed in commercializing it, but I think succeeded in showing in various prototypes, which still exist. I can give you a list of them that you can play with. That the Paskian idea is still very current and not available and would be a great contribution. So one path through cybernetics was wanting to be pragmatic and write code based on Gordon's ideas. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, thanks so much for sharing that, a little bit of you. And it's such a story, it's so much varied. And so I'd like to take a step back here and ask you maybe the hardest question of this interview.
Oh, good.
Which, what is cybernetics? What is this thing that is so hard to characterize, and yet so many people felt drawn into it historically, and you're still part of this universe?
So many people have felt drawn to it, and so many people, conversely, have no idea what it really means. I would say that cybernetics is the recognition that you can think of systems as having a purpose. Instead of worrying about what it's made out of, or specifically what its function is. So the function of a cell, the function of a thermostat, the function of a social system, You can instead look at all of these things as having purpose, and therefore you have to shift from what it's made out of to how it uses information. And that was a profound shift. That was a different way of thinking. One could say that was the beginning of the information age. Most people don't say that. Oh, computers, that was the beginning of the information age. I don't think that's true. Or rather, I prefer it not to be true. So once you think of a system as having a purpose, you realize that I want to do something, I'm trying to do it, and I get this information back to me that says, hey, you're not doing it. So the classic case is you're aiming a ship toward a goal, toward a direction, toward port, let's say. So you aim and then you get blown off course. Classic example. And you say, well, that's what I want, and this is where I am. So that information tells me the action I have to take. So you're sensing, you're comparing to a goal, and then you're taking an action toward that goal. This is the beginning of it. It's not the whole story, but it's the beginning of it. So what are you doing there? You're using information as feedback. It's a word we take for granted, to help you achieve your purpose. And if you go to Google Ngram, you know, the thing that looks at all the publications and will plot you a frequency of use of terms, if you type in feedback, you'll see it kind of stumbles along very, very tiny. And then around the 1940s, when cybernetics comes along, it goes, and that's why. And by the way, if you try that, you should also type in feed-back, which is where it started. You need to put in both terms to get the full sense of it. Like many terms, like before your time, it was E-male. But over time, people get tired of the hyphen because it's more bio cost, it's more effort, so it disappears. So that's the origin story. And Wiener at first claims to have invented the word cybernetics. And then he learns, oh, the Greeks used it, this French guy used it. It's been around a long time. So he didn't invent it. He coined it at a moment, but other people had come up with it earlier. And it comes from a Greek word meaning steers person, meaning the pilot of a ship. And what does a pilot of a ship do? It looks and has a goal, it sees a difference. So acting, comparing to goal, sensing, acting, comparing to goal. So what's different about this? One is it's information, as I've said, but also it's the circularity of it. You don't do it once and you're done. You're continuously doing it. Thermostat is continuously monitoring the temperature of this room and turning the AC on and off and on and off to achieve the goal of a particular set point, 72 degrees or whatever it may be. And there are countless numbers of those systems in the body, for example, countless numbers. Countable, really, but many. Countless is a metaphor for many. So sugar in the blood, oxygen in the blood, temperature of the body, hormones, on and on and on, biological systems can be thought of as cybernetic systems all the time. So when you were a cybernetician in the early days, you said, oh, it's all about purpose, it's all about purpose, it's all about purpose. I'm describing this room in terms of its purpose. I'm describing, well, wait a minute, hold it. They realized, what's my purpose as I'm describing it? So you have the frame of you looking at this thermostat, sensing, comparing, acting. But then wait a minute, if you make the frame larger and you put yourself in that frame, you have to have a purpose too, because you're a cybernetician, you're looking at it as if you have a purpose. And then you realize pretty quickly, and this was true in the very early days, although it's not generally recognized, and some people say, well, Norbert Wiener, you know, he was a first order cybernetician, he didn't make this move to second order. That's not true. He did make the move to second order. He didn't talk about it for political reasons. So what is this move to second order? It's realizing that you are describing something such as a thermostat or a cell or a social system from your point of view. So you're not telling the truth. You're not speaking objectively. You're making decisions in the process of making the description. Well, wait a minute. So that means I'm not objective. That means I'm subjective, subject to my purpose, subject to my biases. So if you embrace cybernetics, in its totality, you realize that it says, I'm going to state this in the strongest way and then back off it a little bit. There is no subject, there is no objectivity, there's only subjectivity. And therefore, I have to be responsible for what I said. I can't say, I just described this room perfectly, it's objective. Okay, that's it, I'm washing my hands. That's the truth, you go do whatever you want to do. And that's both profound and scary. And by the way, scientists, when they're not true scientists, don't like it because they want objectivity. They want to be able to say, oh, I just proved this theorem and now, you can do it. Want to make an atom bomb? Go ahead, not my job, not my responsibility, right? And that, of course, is very much around now with Oppenheimer, which is fascinating, the new movie. So one could talk about what happened to cybernetics. There are many possible versions of that. And one of them is scientists didn't like it because it said the power that they claimed, some claimed that they had, they didn't have. Now, the real scientists, like the ones I came across at MIT, understood this in some way. They may not have been into cybernetics, but they realized that the scientific process is itself an agreement, as Umberto Maturana would say, it's a social agreement about how to do experiments in order to achieve the goal, the purpose of repeatability, which is one possible value you might have when you're acting in the world and observing in the world. And it's great if you want to build electric lights or computers or cars or whatever. Not so great if you're involved in social systems. It doesn't help to want to claim that you know the truth, because that disavows individuality and biologically imperfect creatures and so on and so forth. Maybe that's enough.
This is really fascinating stuff. And I think it's really interesting to think about how in the cybernetic worldview, sort of the observer is intricately linked to what we might consider reality or the truth. How do you, yeah, I guess with these,
yeah, you can't separate them.
Yeah, you can't separate them. So then I guess sort of contrasting cybernetics and science, how do you see cybernetics as providing a platform for shared meaning making? Because if we all have our own subjective version of the truth, how can we kind of synthesize that together into a whole?
It's a great question. So let me step back slightly. Heinz von Forster used to like to say that one of the differences between science and cybernetics is that science is linear, right? It looks at this and it looks at that and it says, how did you get there? It's about causality. It's about this little short thing. And he also liked to say, and maybe he was paraphrasing someone else, science says more and more about less and less, right? Meaning it. So again, repeatability is very important because to go into engineering, you need repeatability, you need reliability, and so science is very helpful there. So when cybernetics comes along and says, we have this subjective thing and there's no truth, it raises the issue, Ketan, that you're raising, which is, how does anything work, right? And now we're into the realm of conversation theory and Pask and his unique contribution in thinking cybernetically about the nature of language and interaction. Maturana does too, and other people do too, but the beauty of Pask is that he not only did a range of experiments in a wide variety of different kinds of hardware and software ultimately, but he also wrote formalisms about how the mind might create what he called coherences and stable points of view about what's in the world. But also he talks a lot about how it is that we agree on things. So if I say glass, you might think I mean this, but you also might think I mean this. And in a second, that is resolved by you asking a question or by the context. I need some water. You got a glass? That's pretty clear. So I'm not sure I can do this succinctly, but in broad terms, by living in a shared world and by being a biological creature, people talk about this as, I don't even know all the terms in activism or embodiment of those kinds of things, that we coexist in the same world at the same time, same enough to point and how does language arise? It arises out of some kind of consistency and agreement that we figure out how to negotiate as a consequence of being able to point and being able to act. And then somehow, I'm not going to give you a theory of language in 20 seconds, somehow this abstracts up to utterances and then ultimately written tokens, which mean that we have some shared experience. Not completely shared, not 100% shared. The glasses you've seen and the glasses I've seen are different, but somehow when we know that their function is to carry fluid so that we can drink, we're good. And it bootstraps from there, he said, snapping his fingers and not explaining it anymore. We get a sense of it, I think, right? So to return to your question, we wish to coordinate our actions in a shared world. And so we not just operate, but we act toward the purpose of understanding each other and converging on meanings and converging on tokens that have those meanings, glass, table, freedom, love, and do our best to interact. It's very messy. It doesn't work all the time. It fails a lot. Sometimes when it fails, it's cool, because when I misunderstand you, I invent something that I wouldn't have invented if I had understood you. An edge case for sure. But that's, in that realm, one could go further there and argue that the shared meaning arises as a consequence of acting together in a common world. And that we have a common biology is probably quite important. And ultimately you get to ideas like values. What are your values? What do you value? Is it more important that I can eat the meat that's in your hand and therefore I'm going to kill you? Or is it more important that we share and therefore build a society, and perhaps there's enough time genetically to, over not 1 million years, but tens of thousands of years, to favor, in terms of natural selection, shared values and coordinated action to build societies. I mean, there's an enormous amount of work, which is not my domain, about the brain and about so-called mirror neurons, which maybe have been deprecated, but the idea that there is a evolutionary advantage in us acting together that seems to be baked in. It's certainly baked into, flocks of birds and herds of elephants and prides of lions and schools of fish, right? I mean, they're coordinating in some way. They're not purely competitive. And perhaps we're an example of that. So having a shared way of seeing, thinking, I don't know what the right word is, it should be more neutral than any of those. Being in the world, that's the word I want. Being in the world is to an evolutionary advantage. And it just has all of the crazy sophistication that modern language and modern technology and physical manifestations have. Now, one could say that there's a limit to the biology. This is going in a different direction. Let me go here for a second. There's a limit to what the biology can absorb. There's a limit to the amount of stress I and you and the society can take. There's a limit to the amount of pressure and therefore, flight or fight, whatever the stress hormones are that degrade the body and cause you to die early and all of those kinds of things. I often think that what's happened in the world today and why the world is so crazy is because we have so far exceeded the biological capacity to accept what? The threat of everyday life, the threat of a lifetime of pressure, the threat of, you name it, population, tribalism, oppression, name a global wicked problem. And you could say the totality of all of those things add up to the inability of an individual human organism to manage, to survive. What's all the depression in people in their teens? Is it only social media? Doesn't have to be more than social media, right? That's enough to explain a lot, right? That's really kind of messed up. But I'm sorry, I've drifted and taken it in that direction. But I think there's a connection between where we started, which is our ability as creatures to have a shared understanding and to live together in sufficient harmony such that we don't wipe ourselves out. But wait a minute, we seem to be in a place where maybe
Yeah.
shows up.
Yeah, no, I love observing, first of all, I guess as a meta comment, just like I think your conversation style feels emblematic of cybernetics in that just, I don't know, seeing how all of these spheres are connected, just the differences between science and cybernetics, and like also just, yeah, these different ways of meaning making that we have in society. I love that you
Yep.
brought up language, because I think it's pretty obvious that babies are not out there trying to reproduce scientific experiments, starting with a certain set of conditions, very precise conditions, and then
Yep.
achieving an expected result. They're just thrown into this society with not a ton of prior context, and we rope them into our meaning making structures somehow, right?
Yep.
um
Yep.
yeah, and we have these meaning making structures that are really effective, and probably made us the most advanced social organization, creatures on earth. But also,
By some measures.
yeah, by some measures, I think probably some other emergent organizations of organisms that do crazy things that humans don't even do.
I don't
um
know, are whales happier? Elephants? Maybe. I don't know, dolphins. Although the whales, you may know, are doing a lot of beaching. They're coming together in many tens or almost 100 and dumping themselves on the beach. What's that about? Nobody
yeah,
knows what that's about.
they seem to do a lot of things in unison that are hard to explain. Like
Yeah.
the orcas will sort of start wearing their prey as a hat, and that'll spread virally as like a global theme. Or they'll start wrecking ships, and all of them are doing it together.
Yeah.
uh
Yeah.
it is pretty crazy that they can do all that. But yeah, I guess the point that I was getting at is like, it seems like, yeah, like our information processing architecture sort of evolved at a time when maybe we had a lot less information to process, or we weren't so hooked into these systems that are bombarding us with information, maybe bombarding us with not so great information. So like, I guess, yeah, like with these kind of information processing challenges, like what role do you see for cybernetics in kind of addressing or providing like a perspective on those challenges?
So if you can hold that question a second,
Sure.
I talk about the metaphors that you're using.
Mm.
You could say that there was a time when there was less information, or you could say that what we feel is important to pay attention to has changed.
Mm.
For example, I can be in the middle of a forest and I can claim that there is a shit ton of information. Now, it's not pixels and words and videos and all the stuff that's coming from this digital screen in front of me, but it's something that I am choosing to pay attention to one way or another. So information is not out there. This is one of the myths. And also, there's no such thing as information transfer, right? This is pure Maturana and also Pask and others. When you say something, the information is not in the words. I make the information by interpreting the words because I am capable, as a cognitive system, of having sufficient shared experience to make meaning out of it. But I'm going to say it again. The meaning is not in the words.
Mm.
This is why ChatGPT is so misrepresented. People, even researchers where I am right now talk about the meaning that it knows and an understanding that it has. Bullshit.
Yeah.
It doesn't know these things. It can't mean these things. because it's a misunderstanding of information. So we accept this metaphor of information. Thanks for the information. But we forget that we made it in our heads. That's a metaphor. We constructed it as a result of our prior experience, which, as Montirano would say, what comes in is a signal that triggers the meaning. And Pask has very, very specific formalisms for describing how this can work. Does it contradict what I know? Is it resonant with what I know? Does it raise a question for me that causes me to ask a question? You go, well, that's a good question. I don't know where you got that question. Anyway, so there's that. Now, on the other hand, and maybe this dovetails into your question, and please put me back on track at any time. We are messing with ourselves with these things. Ooh, that was fun. In part because of what's been spoken about it lately, which is it's designed to affect our endocrine system and our interest in novelty. And there was even a time, do you know this story? There was a time when Facebook gave you a new notification every hour or every regular period of time. And then they realized that they could get your attention much more if it was random, like a slot machine. Slot machines are tantalizing because what comes is unpredictable, and that has to do with novelty, and Pask talked a lot about novelty. So we, the collective we, the platform companies, the companies that need to make money and so engineer the interactivity that they create in order to maximize engagement, which maximize profit, which et cetera, that's all manipulating us, right? And you know all this. This is all straightforward stuff. People have been talking about it for a number of years now. But one of the projects I've been trying to do, but I haven't made very much progress on, is if those algorithms do that, are there alternative algorithms that are more organic, analog, helpful? Okay, I'm not going to make a $20 billion company. Maybe I can make a $500 million company, but I would provide, through algorithms that are cybernetic and consistent with these ideas, an experience that is positive but not addictive.
Mm.
But let's come back. What was the concern in your question?
Yeah, I was just curious, like, so yeah, we have, basically these systems that are built to kind of, manipulate our internal, like information processing systems, or, even like our kind of chemical signaling systems, like the dopamine lottery kind of thing.
Bingo.
Like, how do you see kind of the principles of cybernetics kind of applying to try and tackle those challenges?
Great. Thanks for resetting me. So I want to answer the question in Paskian terms, what Gordon Pask might answer. And the kinds of interactive learning systems that he built, you can distill down. He built many different kinds for many different decades. But when I came across him, he was building something which was based on the idea that if I ask you a question, you as a human naturally think, well, what does Paul know? I know a little bit about his background. I'm not sure he knows about that, but he probably knows about this. So you formulate an answer almost out of your own intuition, but maybe also out of your explicit conscious thinking about it. You give me an answer that you think I will understand based on your model of me and based on, oh, you want to tell me about a piece of research you're doing, and Pangaro knows about cybernetics and a couple of other things. So you cast your answer in terms that are personalized to me. I claim that we don't have such a system commercially available in the world today. We have these AI-based systems that are based on large accumulations of data, such that if I click on a Google, if I give keywords to Google, it gives me a result and a second result and a third result. And it's using that based on some aggregation, some smushing together of millions of people, millions of users, and billions of clicks. That's an AI response. That's a digital response. A cybernetic response is, no, what does Pangaro know? And how can I give him something new such that I'm not boring him by repeating something he knows, but not something so new that it's incomprehensible. Where is that sweet spot in the middle? And Pask called this algorithm idea uncertainty regulation. So the machine is in this loop to regulate how much uncertainty it's presenting to the user at any given time, such that it's novel, but not too novel. Too novel is overwhelming and incomprehensible. Not novel at all is boring and a waste of time. That's the intermediate spot. So that's a cybernetic model, Paskian conversation theory, for how you might create an interaction between a human and content. And I don't see anyone else interested in building that, although I think it's better than anything you can do today. If you talk to, I'm going to really annoy some people I know. AI is often used to decide when to teach students certain kinds of subjects. And they come up with answers like, teach young girls English at 10 a.m. and teach boys math at 1 p.m. I'm not making this up. This was a period of time when AI was being used to decide when was a good way to teach. It's a kind of personalization, but it's not personalization, right? It's aggregation of data and averaging and taking away the individuality, whereas Pask's machines were always in terms of complete individuality. So that's one example. He said early on in a wonderful paper, human beings always seek novelty. It's fundamental to the way they are. But having found novelty, they try to figure it out. His word was control, which is usually misunderstood, so I don't use it first. They try to figure it out. They work with it, they play with it, and they say, oh yeah, I get it. I figured that out. Think of a young child, 2, 3 years old, walking around a store and looking at all of these amazing things over here, and they go and they play and they pull them down and they throw them everywhere. And then, okay, they figure that out. And then they go somewhere else and they play with different packages or different things. Oh, they can climb up. Oh, I just climbed up. Oh, my mother made me not do it. Okay, fine. So the idea that we seek novelty as creatures, which, let's face it, has an evolutionary advantage. One can imagine what they are. But with that insight, he then built a whole series of machines, of which the one I described, which he called Thought Sticker, was about cognitive skills, understanding of the relationship of ideas to other ideas and how they fit together. So that's one way of imagining this engaging loop of interaction where the user has agency. I didn't tell you this part of it. The user starts by saying, oh, what's that? Or I don't know what that is. Education today, right? You walk into a classroom and the teacher says, hi, I want you to learn this. That's just bad pedagogy, right? That doesn't start from where the student's interest is. But a cybernetic teaching machine could do that. Does that answer you a little bit? It's one example, perhaps, of how cybernetic can be involved. But yeah, I don't know. You ask a deeper question. I should think about it some more. I mean,
I think that's a great start, at least. It's like getting at the fundamental difference between, current education or current recommendation algorithms where we're kind of just being handed something versus being brought into conversation and kind of using our agency to learn about things. So I think that's very fascinating.
Let me go a little further. So you use the word agency, which is also occurring to me again. I have a parable that I use, if I may repeat it to you. I do this sometimes in classes or in talks. I ask someone in the audience to ask me, where is there good pizza? And I say, thank you for asking. The best pizza in town is right across the street at Luigi's Pizza. And then I say, now ask me, why is it good pizza? And they say, Paul, why is Luigi's Pizza the best pizza? And I say, screw you, I'm not going to tell you. And everybody gets really uncomfortable. And then I say, I just described Google. And people have that reaction. They go, ah. So one can say a lot from that. Why do we accept this treatment from our machines. We wouldn't accept this treatment from another human being. Why do we let our machines treat us this way? That's even worse. Well, of course, we know the answer. It's about profit and commercial and proprietary algorithms. So I say the minimum ethical interface is one where I could say, or you could say, why is Luigi's the best pizza? And it would tell you the truth about how it made that decision. Now, people respond to that to me in various ways. Oh, it's proprietary. I say, I don't care. How it's computed might be proprietary, but how did you decide on that specific answer? Tell me that. It's one response. Another response is as well, it's a machine learning algorithm, it doesn't know. I say, okay, fine. So let's ban those. And let's only have algorithms that can explain themselves, because it's not ethical to say, screw you, I'm not going to tell you why I'm telling you that. It's just not ethical. So stop it. So we could build, I'm answering your question again, what does cybernetics afford us in designing algorithms? We could teach and even require, or at least allow people to choose. Do I want an algorithm that says, screw you, or do I want an algorithm that explains itself? I'm going to go over here. I'm not going to make these people $10 billion rich, but I'm going to make them $500 million rich, as per the example before, right? And I'm going to get an answer. Why is Luigi's Pizza great? Well, the algorithm might say, Luigi's Pizza is great. You know where I'm going to go with this. Because it got good reviews. Well, that's kind of trivial. We don't care about that. What would be more interesting would be because, Paul, I know you like gluten-free. And they're really good at gluten-free. Or because they do sustainable sourcing and they pay their people well, or whatever. It can give me the values that are behind what that offer is in Luigi's Pizza. And I can say, those are my values too. I want them or I don't. So I'm going to go over there instead. Without that information, what am I getting? I'm getting a recommendation that's to some extent to my advantage. Do you know the transition between Alta Vista and Google? Alta Vista was the first search engine that was on the web. And it gave you a list of results, but they were not page ranked. And of course, once the number of data results exploded on the web, Alta Vista became obsolete and Google overtook it. And of course, now, as everyone knows, you go to a Google results page or you go to an Amazon product page, and it's a freaking mess. You can't find your way from the sponsored ads. You don't know whether this is a valid offer. You get all of these pseudo questions. Anyway, that's invented. So, I mean, these are just my examples. I suspect that if we spent an hour at a whiteboard, we could imagine many, many more examples that we could invent on the fly.
Thanks so much for sharing all of those perspectives, Paul. And I think we're painting a picture of cybernetics here. There's very much transdisciplinary. We're dancing within different perspectives and fields and looking at different ideas and concepts. And that's always been the core of cybernetics, right?
Yes.
I mean, you've talked about the notion of a system, the notion of systems with purpose. You talk about data versus information and the relationship we have with machines. So all of this is interesting, and we don't get a lot of those conversations, for example, in the AI community. The AI community will talk about the next model, the next inventions, but often the complexity of how all those interactions and how those parts are going to be in the future is often a complex topic, because often we don't know. We can't model the whole system, especially when we're talking about society. But I love the attempt that cybernetics tries have in bringing all those different things. And it's just fascinating that, there has been a movement that has it start with the invent of computers itself, So it's very fascinating. And I wanted to bring the conversation a little back to the notion of purpose, because I feel like that's one of the things that cybernetics bring to the table, that it's so much important and so much underlooked in today's world, which is we have the notion that machines can have purpose. just like human beings can have purpose, we have built machines that have some degree of agency or sometimes full agency. I have a few questions about this. First of all, where does this purpose come from? And how do the purpose of different machines matter? Like what's the purpose of general AI systems, for example? And yeah, maybe if you could
Good.
talk a little bit about
Yes. Well, in a first order sense, we say that you're asking where the purpose comes from. Is the system built by a human and put into the world like a thermostatic system that controls the temperature of the air? That purpose comes from the designer, of course. If I walk outside and I say, well, what am I going to do? Oh yeah, I'll go to the store. I need to go to buy milk. That purpose comes from me, right? And I mean, it gets messy pretty quickly here. I think it's reasonable to just say that human beings have their own purpose. Animals create a purpose, but it's not clear how much range of option they have, right? We can do lots of different things at any given moment. So first order is we have purpose, we create a goal. What I left out earlier when I'm talking about the ship is, this is really what your question I think is, Guy, which is who sets the goal? Well, the pilot of the ship sets the goal, but in the course of heading on course, the pilot of the ship say, well, no, that's not the right goal. Right? So goal is not a fixed thing. And the cybernetic model, some people misinterpret this, but does not say you have to have a fixed goal to be cybernetic. No, you can start out and then decide on the basis of acting that up here, there's something that says, no, that's not really my goal. I was going to make a minimum viable product to do this, but I'm going to pivot. I'm going to do something else, right? We change our goals all the time. But I have to add the second order thing, which is everything I just said about purpose is a description and a reflection made by someone outside the system that has the goal. And that makes people uncomfortable, really. I mean, if I walk into the kitchen and I get a drink out of the fridge, was I thinking about that consciously? And did I have a purpose, or was it afterwards that I said, well, I'm thirsty? Maybe that's not such a great example. But am I dancing at all in the direction you meant when you asked, where does purpose come from? Was that the question you asked?
Absolutely, absolutely. Because we have historically a really tricky relationship with purpose when we refer to purpose in nature, right? The whole notion of evolution from Darwin kind of dismissed the idea of purpose as like the core feature of evolution.
Yeah.
But now we see a very interesting thing that cybernetic offers, which is you can combine teleology, the notion that, yeah, we can have purpose in things with a more descriptive way of looking at reality and looking at things, right? So I'm interested in how do we bridge those two different seemingly contrasting perspectives of like nature can have purpose, but you could also define them in very descriptive terms.
We say nature has purpose. We can say that even though we're all expecting the heat death of the universe and entropy to take over, somehow living systems arise as a result of bringing energy into any situation that has any kind of material, and order forms in the higher levels, order upon order upon order. Heinz von Forster talks a lot about this. His example is if you took a pile of magnets and you put them in a box and you looked in the box, you'd say, well, that's not very ordered. But if you shook the box and then you open the box, you would see it had ordered itself by the north-south poles of the pieces. So material plus energy creates order. So self-organizing systems and so on and so forth. So one can say, this is an observer statement, that that's why when I look outside, I see trees and I see squirrels and I see cars and I see people. Because in the evolution of millions of years, the chaos has led to those amounts of orders. I don't think I can help you much with the teleological question. I don't know where these things come from. You can't explain the Big Bang. Sorry, those are two different things. I'm not sure. You're asking me to bridge something that I don't think of as different.
Yeah, those questions are hard, and but then they've been so interesting. It's been so interesting in terms of how cyberneticians looked at the machines and how you even like talked about the the ethical implications of machines in comparisons to how we humans relate to each other, right? And I, I'm also interested in, you talked about a little bit about AI and the ethical implications of AI,
Yeah.
but a little bit more on that. What does cybernetics offer to the current conversation on artificial intelligence specifically? Besides the ethical implications, do you think there's a perspective here that is usually not talked about when we have conversations on AI?
That's a great prompt. I think there are a lot of things. I like to think of AI as starting from the zeros and ones and using the logic of Turing machines to calculate stuff and to try to get closer and closer and higher in some hierarchy, or some rising degree of sophistication of intelligence. And like the old AI cliche, you can climb a tree and think you're getting closer to the moon, but you can't get there from there. And I believe that the logic of zeros and ones in Turing computability will not get there. And I don't say that because I think it's impossible to build an intelligent machine, but because I know a different way of thinking about it, which is Pascal conversation theory. He doesn't specify the substrate in which to make the formalisms that he writes, but he does give very, very specific formalisms for how you have a system, you have signals coming into the system that jostles what's in the system, and that coherences get created, contradictions arise, they get resolved, and the sort of the knowledge model inside of a cognitive system gets more and more complicated. It's kind of an explanation of how we go from being born and having sensory inputs to having this conversation. So I always felt, so that's a little bit about where AI starts and where it goes. I've always felt that cybernetics was going in the other direction. Cybernetics was starting from the idea of purpose and action and acting in the world towards something simple, something complex, something vague, something specific, but wanting to get somewhere. Again, sensing, comparing to goal and acting. So AI, when I first started studying it as an undergrad, was fascinating to me, and computers were fascinating to me, but there's something inadequate about it. There was something unsatisfying. But when I started to talk to Jerry Lettvin and he prepared me to meet Pascal, I realized that cybernetics was a different path, different direction. That was much more organic, much more humane and human, and also something I could still write code from, as I said earlier. So the problem is, you can't fight the tide, right? It's a very small voice in a very complicated world in which people are making billions and trillions of dollars saying AI and neural nets are all we need. We're on our way to an artificial general intelligence. I don't think so. It's just my bias. Again, because I see Pask and I say, well, that's a way of doing it, and that's really kind of stupid.
Hmm.
So I'm not sure how much further I can go with that. I do believe, as you know, that I think cybernetics has a lot to offer, even by contrast. That's why I said earlier, I'm trying to do this as one studio within this new Macy idea, which I can explain another time. You have all these ways of AI's approach to algorithms and interactivity and prediction and recommendation and stuff. Isn't there a parallel set that's much more humane using cybernetics that doesn't have the disadvantage of these and has the advantage of being more organic and ethical? If I weren't teaching so much and doing a symposium in the fall, I would have been working on those things, on that collection, such that if a designer comes to me and says, hey, I want to build a company that does X, Y, Z, I say, great. You can either drink from that fountain of AI, or you can drink from that fountain of cybernetics, and you get very different results. That may not be specific enough, but keep prompting.
Do you feel like those two philosophies are like completely incompatible, like AI and cybernetics?
No, I think cybernetics really affords a synthesis. As my partner Karen likes to say, that she thinks of cybernetics as being bilingual. It is both analog and digital, because it's not about the embodiment, it's not about what it's made out of, it's how it uses information and how it's coupled to an environment in which it's operating. And the internal mechanisms are different too, because the intentions of the internal mechanisms are different. The intentions of the internal mechanism of Facebook or Google are the intentions of the money making behind it. And I'm aside things like you're the product is the cliche, right, in platforms, right? But if you had a cybernetic framework, a way of thinking about the thing you were building, and you really did want to support my purpose, as opposed to the purpose of the platform company that wants to make the money, then that alone would be a big difference. But also the nature of the algorithms you constructed would be different. And I said a little bit about that earlier in terms of uncertainty regulation being one example of a cybernetic algorithm. So cybernetics, I think, can be unifying because it's transdisciplinary, doesn't care what the thing is made out of, but it wants to characterize the loops and the loops within loops and the goals and the sub-goals and the sub-goals if you want to go down, or higher level goals and higher level goals if you want to go up in that, hierarchy of what you're doing and why you're doing it. I think even that framework is powerful and valuable to think about. I can tell one more story about a Pasquian machine, if you don't mind. So one of the earliest machines he built was something called Musicolor. Music and color is one word, with a U, by the way, O-U-R, since it's a British one. And Musicolor was a machine that was very crude by today's standards. It was all analog and vacuum tubes, and, complicated relays and wires, and, stuff put together by a soldering iron. And what it did was it listened to a performer, let's say, playing on a keyboard. And the crudest way of describing it, although I have to fix that crude explanation immediately, is it produced a kind of light show. So as a result of playing music, it gave you a light show. But unlike nearly every single light show you've ever seen in your life, if not every single one, those have fixed mappings. So if you play certain notes or in certain frequency bands, that happens. So if you do something now and you do it again 5 minutes later and you again 10 minutes later, you get the same result. Pretty much, right? Because they're reacting. It's like, you walk toward a door and the door opens. It's a reactive system. That's what it's designed to do. So every time you play the same sound, it makes the same light show. Musicolor didn't do that. Musicolor would begin to respond based on your playing But if you stayed in a certain frequency range, let's say between middle C and C, so you begin to play and it gets more and more sensitive and it starts to listen to you and it starts to give you the response. But let's say you stay in that octave range. Slowly, over about 10 or 15 seconds, it would realize, I'm anthropomorphizing it, it would listen in that range and it would calculate that you were not varying your pitch very much. And so it would get less and less sensitive. So at first you play a little bit and it begins to respond and you're happy and it's playing and it's responding. And then it stops responding. So what do? You say, oh, no, it's not responding. So you change what you're doing until you get it to respond again. So Pask talked about this as getting bored. So the partner in your improvisational playing had only the feature of sensing a certain kind of repetition. And if you began this repetition, it would become less sensitive until you saw that and changed your behavior, created something novel in order to get it to react to you. And this engaged humans in this loop of, shall we call it, creativity. Now, it did this not in one channel, so one listening channel and one light, but 5 lights. And it also had a rhythm-related thing as well, where it amplified your inaccuracies in rhythm. And there was one other thing probably, but not worth describing. So you're playing and you're not conscious of exactly what you're doing that is causing it to respond or not respond, but you're engaged in this improvisational creative loop with this big machine that was getting so hot, sometimes it caught on fire. We're talking about the 1950s. And it was a sensation. We're actually trying to replicate it right now. We're trying to understand how it really worked based on the descriptions. And we're going to look for money to replicate it. My colleague, TJ McLeish, who I also work with in a replication of another one of Pask's pieces. So why do I tell that long story? Very crude technology, but a clear idea of how you want to engage a human being in a way that enhances their experience, in this case, by causing them or encouraging them to be creative in a way that they might not, because you're seeing, the machine is seeing, metaphor, computing that the human is being repetitive in a certain way, and it changes its response. So I think it's a really nice example that you don't need a lot of complexity in the technology, you need a good idea. As I said earlier, there's nothing more powerful than a good theory. So that would be an analog approach to causing an interactivity. Could you do a form of music color in interacting with content, such that you would present novel texts or novel videos to a human, and then you would ask them to somehow give an input as a result of that, and then whether or not that was the same or different, you would give them a different response? Of course you can. Nobody does it. Nobody has this kind of architectural sense of what interaction means. Most people think intelligence. Most people think intelligence is a property of the system. Oh, that AI is very smart. We're going to make an artificial general intelligence. Intelligence is a property of an interaction. It's a consequence of systems coming together and interacting in a way that people say, well, that's intelligent. My example of this is I have a really brilliant friend who, when walking around New York, is as stupid as you can imagine, doesn't pay attention to where he's going, gets run over by bicyclists going the wrong way in one-way streets, is kind of looking around and people knock into him all the time. It's not that he is stupid, but he is stupid in the context of New York City. He is not stupid in the context of a conversation about conversation theory. So information is not in the words. Intelligence is not in the system. Interaction is not founded in predictability, but rather in uncertainty and possibility. These are cybernetic ideas that could be a foundation of teaching interaction design.
That's wonderful. Yeah. And I know that unfortunately, Gordon Pask didn't leave us with any videos of Musicolor, but I hopefully this recreation of Musicolor can come out and
I have a
everyone
lot
can
of confidence in it. I have some genius collaborators.
Yeah, I'm excited. I'm
Really
super
good.
excited. Well, I think we're approaching the end of the podcast, so I want to ask a few questions, maybe one or two. One of them is, what kind of advice would you give to young people nowadays, like people who are especially our age, who are in college or have recently graduated, on how to develop a relationship with technology in general, how to see the world
Mm,
through a more cybernetic lens, let's say.
what a great question. First of all, I would dedicate every minute of the rest of my life to helping answer that, because I think there's nothing greater to contribute than that. And a lot of the work I'm doing and the associations I'm in and the courses I teach and so on are exactly in that area. So let me give you a sliver of what might be an answer, and ask me every week forever. The easy answers, of course, are not the most interesting ones. The easy answers are, read about it, blah, blah, blah. I would tap into the networks that do exist. And instead of asking me or asking somebody else, what do I think is important? Why do you think Stafford Beer's work or Heinz von Forster's work is important? I would center your questions for those in cybernetics, or for the readings that you would do in cybernetics, in your interests. What do you think is important in your life today? The reason why I say that is multifold. One is because we're really of very different generations. When I was your age, older people were more the same to me. But so much has changed in my lifetime, right? The way you've interacted with technology, the media you've been exposed to, the way the world has changed, all kinds of things are different. So I don't really expect that my worldview and your worldviews are the same. Now, that's not a bad thing. It's good that you have a different worldview, because you have to live in a different world. Right? So the world has changed. Again, the conventional approach would be and societies in cybernetics have done this for the entire period I've been involved with them, which is more than 50 years. It's embarrassing. No, not more. Almost. Doesn't matter. The point of the story is, you can go a lot of places and get lectured on cybernetics, and you can read a lot of books on cybernetics. But I don't think that's the way to start. I think the way to start is, what do you care about? Where are your values? What domain are you interested in? Do you want to build an app? Do you want to build an interactive experience? Do you want to do VR? Do you want to change a community? Do you want to solve homelessness? What challenge do you have passion for? And then look for people in systems and cybernetics who can answer your questions in your terms about your interests. And the reason is, my worldview doesn't matter anymore. Your worldview is the future. And so I think if you start from there, you'll be more productive. First of all, you'll be more true to yourself. The number of times I've been in grad school critiques in which a student presents work and the elder is asked to comment, the number of times the elder's comment is, I think you should do this, or why didn't you read that? And I want to strangle that person, because they're not paying attention, right? They're not paying attention to where this human being, who, yes, happens to be younger, and who, yes, perhaps hasn't read all that you've read, but why should that person care about where you're coming from? You should care about where they're coming from. And again, I'm very concerned about the transgenerational challenge. So cybernetics is about transdisciplinary. It needs to be now also transglobal and diverse and inclusive, of course, but I think it also needs to pay attention to transgenerational. So this would be my advice: to stay true to what your interests are. As Steve Jobs said, stay young, stay foolish. Is that what he said? Stay yourself would be what I would add to that.